almost everyone starts with this idea of our story really doesn't matter. Or maybe they have a view of story that's, it just comes down to history, dates, timelines, who did what, black and white photo. And so there's a few things there. One, I like to tell people that history informs, story transforms. So if your view of story is just, hey, let's mark down all the dates. Here's what happened when we started this, and here's what happened when we did this, and here's a photo of it. Wow, we've captured our history. Not only you've captured your history, but you haven't captured the story. And so the vision for my life, what I like to tell people is that I want people and families to value their story with a divine purpose. And I say that because I've heard it said that for the reader to hear anything on the page, you have to scream at the page if you want the reader to hear a whisper.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on this show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Caleb Breakey, the founder of Renown Publishing, guiding high-impact leaders and ultra-high net worth families through an 18-month transformational storytelling journey with a team of award-winning wordsmiths, including contributors to bestsellers on the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today lists. Renown creates exceptional books designed to preserve legacy and inspire human flourishing. Caleb, how are you? So nice to see you.
I'm doing so fantastic. Thank you for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun, I can already tell.
Well, I told you that our worlds overlap in a fascinating way because I work with families with multi-generational fortunes, and those families have stories. And I realized that the portfolios that I manage, the stock portfolios, are as important as the stories themselves. And in a way, as I mentioned to you, I feel like those stories with the values they can pass on can actually help me do the work I'm trying to do. I love the idea of preserving those stories, and I have 1,000 questions. But let's start with you. And as you may know, I like to ask my guests about the early days, your childhood, your upbringing. How do you think that time shaped you and maybe led you to the career path that you chose?
So I was raised in a high control, high demand environment. And it was a community in which a lot of people looked the same, sounded the same. When my wife and I, who we met in this community, left this community, we're both empaths, and for the very first time got to see how different every human is. And so we were the couple who for a date night would just want to go over Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, any sort of personality test we could get on, because we were fascinated by the spectrum of humanity. And this led me to a career in journalism. I love asking questions. I'm very curious. My wife's very curious, and we just love people and all the different shades of people. And so story is really shaped by contrast. And so our story was really contrasted with how we were, I would say, late to the game in seeing the beauty of people and the spectrum of humanity to where we are today. And so that was really the beginning. It was meager beginnings, which we would never want to go back to, but in a strange way can also thank for the profound curiosity and delight we now have in understanding humans at a very deep level.
It's so profound what you just said. And the way I'm hearing it is you were living in a certain world where you couldn't see the full spectrum. And then you end up discovering there's much more. I don't want to hijack this conversation, but I grew up in communist Poland. So until 10, I was living in a very different world. And then the world opened up and it was almost like turning from black and white to color. Stores opened up.
Yes.
Foreign products came in. So I have that vivid memory. And my cousins that are 5 years younger than me, they don't remember that. And I feel like that dual experience that clearly you had in a very different setting helped you to fine tune, zoom in, and see things that maybe somebody else would not see. And I'm sure it's going to come across throughout this conversation. I want to ask you about the inspiration. You focus on family legacies specifically. What inspired you? How did that come about?
My family come from I would say, modest 3-generation car dealership family. And we were the family that would have 70 people at Thanksgiving, Christmas. And when my grandparents passed away, the family really broke apart. And what I saw from this was there was a certain glue there that everyone experienced, but no one really saw its function and why it was happening and how it was happening. There was this deep love and respect for the patriarch and matriarch of the family, but when they passed away, there was nothing left. The glue had passed away, it was gone. And so you had the infighting, some lawsuits, bickering, shunning, a lot of gossip of who's not seeing who. And it really affected me as a kid because that was all I ever knew. I didn't start having small, Christmas gatherings, holiday gatherings with my family until pretty much my grandparents passed away, because we were that big family that just loved being around each other and would celebrate 6 to 7 birthdays in a month, everyone coming together. And so, what's the glue if there is no glue? And that's really where story started to become more to me, because, and I'm getting ahead of myself because my understanding wasn't about story at a highly developed point at this time. But what I really now focus on is attaching story to values. And I think the family that I grew up in, there was this understated, here's what we value. We obviously value harmony and love and all these things, but there was never any stories attached to it, which left us similar to like an Enron situation where you have this very successful company and you've got these words on a wall that state who you are. But if there's no stories attached to it, how are they ever going to be real? How are they ever going to be true? How are they ever going to be passed on? And so I saw firsthand how wisdom and values dissipate without that meat of story of who we are, where we came from. And I'm not saying that having stories would have saved my family from becoming this, but it certainly would have provided a vehicle through which, hey, tell me that story about why our family got together, and starting to understand like why our family worked so well for so many years and then why it didn't. So that's kind of where it all started, you might say, but the timeline is interesting on how I came to understand what story actually does, its function, if you will.
But it's very personal. It's your very personal why. It came from your own experience. And from all the conversations I'm having on this podcast and off the record, on the record, I realized that a lot of people that are really committed to doing something in their life, they have a very clear and strong why. And that why always goes back to something very, very personal and not always comfortable. Sometimes it's a challenge, a pain, a hurdle, an experience that led them to pay attention to one aspect of the human experience. And for you, it's storytelling. I'm very curious, when you work with families, you're helping them unlock stories that they might not even realize how significant they are to their legacy. Can you talk about that? What's your secret? How do you find those stories?
Wife and I have a saying, and it's not a say, it's just truth is stranger than fiction. That comes up and we'll say TSF. That's what's our little marker of truth is stranger than fiction. And when we say that, we're saying that there's so much beauty and goodness and crazy pattern recognition that can happen when you see story. So you had just talked about like a why. And here's the pattern that I've seen talking with numerous families or individuals. And that is almost everyone starts with this idea of our story really doesn't matter. Or maybe they have a view of story that's, it just comes down to history, dates, timelines, who did what, black and white photo. And so there's a few things there. One, I like to tell people that history informs, story transforms. So if your view of story is just, hey, let's mark down all the dates. Here's what happened when we started this, and here's what happened when we did this, and here's a photo of it. Wow, we've captured our history. Not only you've captured your history, but you haven't captured the story. And so the vision for my life, what I like to tell people is that I want people and families to value their story with a divine purpose. And I say that because I've heard it said that for the reader to hear anything on the page, you have to scream at the page if you want the reader to hear a whisper. And if someone's coming from such a place of, my story really isn't that important, it doesn't mean anything, who would want to hear this? It doesn't have value. You need to get so far to the other side for the next generation to hear anything. Story is valuable. Like, I remember I used to do all car shows growing up. That's where my dad and my brothers always wanted to be. And the way that they would view these cars was confounding to me, because they would go from car to car, look at the bumper, the wheels, the engine, and everything about it. And I was like, this is how I now view people and how I hope people view themselves. Look at you. Look at how incredibly fashioned you are. And just down to the smallest detail, look at how fascinating you are, that you won the lottery being born here on this earth. And so that's really the value that I want to tap into, because this is not some pie in the sky, everyone has value, cheap talk. Like, that is a reality. When you actually dive into your story or your family story, it is stranger than fiction, meaning it is something you could put on the big screen, like you would go and pay for a ticket to watch your favorite movie. It has all those elements. Why? Because I know from thousands and thousands of interviews, you cannot escape the hero's journey, which we're all living in our own way. And it is fascinating. And the reason why we don't step into it is because we don't value it or we don't see it right now.
You create the space for people to find that story, find that it matters, and then find those elements that maybe they even forgot about, that they're the building blocks of the legacy that they have. You talked about transformation, and I'm very curious, your experience seeing those transformative moments when you witness the family see themselves in a different way because of this experiment or this exercise of writing down the story.
There's one client I'm working with right now, comes from a ultra high net worth family business that he created. He was first generation wealth creator, and they've had values in their families and values in their business, and they're very similar. They overlap. And this particular client, every time we have spoken, pretty much during one of the hours that we've spent together, there's a pause and a deep, it's like a tsunami comes over him. You can see it. It's invisible, but he pauses, and all of his feeling gets stuck right here in his throat. You can see it happen. He can't talk, because he's feeling almost as if he sees the values of his family and his business run through his blood, because he's telling not only his story, but how his story, the choices he made, are a reflection of what was passed down to him from his own parents and grandparents. He traced his family history back to the Civil War. Imagine the difference of sharing a story about, or just telling your kids, like, we value integrity. And the kids are like, well, what's integrity? Imagine just having words, which can be hollow, or telling them about the time, as this patriarch told me about the time that when he was doing business at first, he thought he was God's gift to business, the Midas touch, everything's turning to gold, and then finds out that his partner was caught with a suitcase full of cocaine, and everything went to rubble, and he lost everything. And this was a man who had integrity, and he was sitting there on his bedroom in the fetal position, and his wife got on the ground with him and just hugged him, which was a beautiful moment in and of itself. But what came after that that highlighted so much of his integrity, the story that will go on for generations, is that his lawyer said, you need to declare bankruptcy immediately. This is the only way to do it. And he did not feel at peace with that at all. And he said, I cannot do this. This is not how I operate, And his lawyer said, well, that's not the real world. And he said, well, thank you anyway, but I'm going to call my debtors and I'm going to give them the one thing that I have, which is my word. And I will pay back every dollar I owe them with interest if they just trust my word that I will do this. And within 7 years, he had paid back equivalently of about $1 million. And he did it. Sometimes he said he only was able to pay off $5 in a month. But do you feel the difference of saying that you are a person of integrity or a family of integrity, as opposed to sharing the story where your integrity shone through? So those are the transformative moments. And I think the reason why he got choked up, the reason why he would feel that in his throat is because it wasn't an aspirational idea. It was a lived experience. And he traced moments of integrity back to his family that, yes, happened in different ways, but that's kind of the beauty of story, is that we're all living the human experience. And what's true today about integrity was true 3,000 years ago, and it will be true 3,000 years in the future. It'll look different, but integrity is integrity. And he felt it in his blood. Those are the moments that I love to see. And they usually are accompanied with a deep emotion that's hasn't been felt for a while.
It's so profound and so powerful. And when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that stories are memories, right? It's one person's story. It's somebody else's memory. And those memories bring up emotions, especially if you're the one narrating the story and sharing it with you. That I was there, that's what happened, that's how it felt, and he was on that floor with his wife hugging him, right? I think it might be very, very hard to not only tell the story, but with you relive that time. I'm curious, when you're collecting those bits of somebody's life and translating someone's life and experience into a narrative, because it ends up being a long story, how do you do that? How do you pick the stories? How do you connect them? There's a little bit of science, a little bit of art that comes to it.
There is. And this is the role of what I personally have found to be my gift to the world. The reason I feel like I was born is that, we talked about personalities. If you do Enneagram, I'm a 5, I'm a wing 4. So a 5 is known for soaking in information, loves to hear. I'm known in my own family as the person who asks a lot of questions. And I love that. I love getting the whole picture, if you will. And then the 4 is known as the creative. So what do we do with that now? And it is an art and a science, because most people don't value their story, because to them, their story actually is quite boring. They go, who would ever want to hear this? Or, everyone's gone through this, so who would ever be interested? And you don't realize that everything that hits the big screen, it's the same, 10 or 15 stories over and over again. And so what's the piece? And, we were just onboarding a client last week, and one of the very first things we do is let's talk about the chronology. That's what you might consider the boring stuff. What happened, from when you were born to up until today? What are those highlights that have happened? Why was it important? Get the chronology. But the real magic happens is when you start looking at the story cinematically. This is where you decide what belongs on the cutting board floor. What pieces do you really want to zoom in on? And within our stories, there's always embedded in it some form or fashion of the hero's journey, which in a real truncated fashion would be, give me a snapshot of who this person is. I want to care about them and know where they're at in life and maybe some of their false beliefs that they believe right now, so that I just get a sense of what this person's journey is. And then something happens that disrupts their life. It kind of pushes them through this door where they now have to make a decision of, do I go, do I not? There's a debate there, and then it moves into these movie trailer moments, where you'd see on the big screen what they show you in a minute, to get you to come see the movie of how they're changing and growing and transforming. And then there's going to be a dark night of the soul where all the walls are coming in on them and it seems like there's no escape. And then boom, out the other side, they see the light, and now they are the exact opposite of where they started in some way. And that is the human experience over and over and over again. It's growth. We started somewhere and now we're somewhere else. So that is the challenging aspect of what we do. But that is the exact reason why I feel like I'm on this earth, is to invite people into that transformative process of, yes, laying out the chronology but then figuring out, what does this look like cinematically? How can we see this family story or this personal narrative as if it was on the big screen? Because it is. It's just you have to frame it in a certain way and focus on the right moments at the right times.
Yeah, I love everything I'm hearing. What I'm thinking of is when I'm onboarding a new client and they come to me with a family fortune inheritance or what they saved throughout their lifetime, I always start with, just tell me how this came about. And it's such an open-ended question, but it takes you on a whole fascinating journey. And some of it might be very positive. Some of it might be maybe some regrets, sacrifices that were made, however you want to present it. But you get the context of what that money means to them. And I can't imagine doing my work, investing that money without understanding what that money means to you. 1 million is not equal the other million, or 10 or 100. You have to understand. I need to understand. What kind of money are we talking about and how it came about? You touched on it. I want to explore it a bit more, but I'm sure there are some difficult family histories as well. Some maybe stories they're not proud of, maybe some stories that bring tears. How do you create a positive legacy document, knowing that those stories can come about and all of us have something like that to share?
We started this discussion by talking about, hey, what was my beginning? And frankly, it's not the beginning I'm most proud of. There's still parts of me that would rather cower in shame about my upbringing, parts of where I came from. And everyone has that. And I've mentioned the hero's journey a couple times, but 70% of the hero's journey is pretty much either failure or I don't know what I'm doing. It's a sense of chaos. It's a sense of failure, failing forward. And for whatever reason, we tend to want to suppress it. There's a lot of guilt, a lot of fear, a lot of shame attached to it. And so a lot of what we do is we honor the hard stuff. One of my favorite quotes on writing was from Stephen King, who in his book on writing says, the writer's job is to tell the truth. And what I love about that is that if we don't honor not just the successes in our lives, like let's say the last 30% of the hero's journey, where everything's going good and we're learning and we're growing, but we don't see where we started, we actually have forfeited the beauty of the story. We forfeited the power of the story. And so much is providing space and safety to show people that our story is where our power and strength is. And you honestly learn more from your mistakes and failures than you do your successes. Think about the next generation. This is one of the interesting things about what we do when it comes to capturing family legacy is it's giving a permission that actually the next generation isn't all that interested in what you have to say, your imperatives, if you will. All they really need to hear is, I love you, I'm proud of you, here's how I messed up, here's what I hope for your future. What they really need to see is how you lived, because they're going through the same things. And whether you failed or succeeded, they will learn from it. They will capture the values and the wisdom in it, whether you executed it the way you wanted to or not. Using that type A language of execution, we learn far more from failure, and we respect those who can be open about their failure, who can be open about the authenticity of their story. And so everyone's at a different place. Some people do have closets that they never want to open again, and I understand that and respect it. But it is my personal goal to give the permission to say that there's actually power in those places. And the more power, and the more you open up, the more powerful the story is.
You touched on the future generation, because a lot of it is being done, obviously, to look back and reflect, but also for that generation that's maybe around already, or maybe the generations that are yet to come. With the families that I work with, I got to work with multiple generations, and it's fascinating to see the continuity. I'm very intrigued about the fact that two generations, and sometimes even siblings that are years apart, have a very different perception of things, even how they think about that family. One specific example comes to mind that you might be familiar with is Rockefeller letters to his son, 30 some of them. And one of those stories I'll bring up real quick is a story when the Rockefeller Sr. tells his son about the day at his school when they were taking a picture of the kids. And Rockefeller Sr. was so poor that the teacher asked him not to be in the photo, not to embarrass the class. And I was reading that story and I was thinking, Rockefeller's son, same family, one generation apart, has no way of knowing what it felt like to be asked as the only kid in that classroom not to be in the photo. And even now it gives me goosebumps to think about it. You tell the story, but there's no way that your kid could know what it felt like. So I'm thinking about some patterns that you can see that resonate more deeply with the future generations, and you can, in a way, translate the family wisdom from generation to generation, given that they're living a very different life.
Yeah. Timeless human experience. Every time we're sitting down and writing a chapter, we have two very core things going on. One, we want to bring people into the moment, show it. I love how you just shared that story, and I can already picture this photo about to be taken. I can see this young boy in just garments that are smelly and ripped, and the person who's taking the picture, maybe even a mean scowl, just say, hey, you get out of the picture. I can see it. I can visualize it. And when I flow through and now I'm stepping into this boy's heart, I feel the shame. I feel the hurt and the pain, and why is this happening to me, and why can't I be like these other kids? All these questions going on in my mind. The next generation is no different in that feeling. It just comes across differently. There is a universal feeling that we need to tap into and can. So I'm friends with many rising gens who feel their own shame in a very different way of, what did I do to deserve to be born into this family of wealth? Do I mean anything? Do I bring anything to the table, or is what I do, have doors just been opened to me? But I really don't bring that value. There's so many of the same questions of, do I belong, and why can't I be like these other people? It's the same questions. It's the same feeling. That's why I mentioned that when we tap into the heart of story, we're tapping into something that is true today, that was true 3,000 years ago, that's true 3,000 years in the future. And no matter what lens you put on it, I come from wealth, I don't come from wealth, you're going to experience the same thing. Think about, our fathers or our grandfathers who experience a death of a dear one, a friend, a spouse. That is death. That is a deep grief. Imagine the next generation, a 16 or 17-year-old who just got broken up with the first time. They are experiencing their first death, their first grief. It's the same human emotion. One actually deals with death, another one just feels like a death, but they are the same. So that is how you resonate with the future generation, is you're tapping into something. I always tell people that readers, books are never about the author. They're always about the reader, and the reader are always looking for themselves in the story. I can only imagine what that meant to other Rockefellers to see how their dad responded. I mean, that story I've heard multiple times, where if you come from that type of shame around money, often those same people are the most driven people I've ever met, because they never want to experience that again, ever. They never want to deal with out. And so they can't turn it off, So a long answer to a fairly short question.
Somebody told me that it feels like trying to outrun the wolves. And I said, what wolves? And they say, the wolves that are chasing you and bringing you back to where you used to be. And I think it's such a powerful image that I can't get out of my head. And when somebody told me wolves, I pictured winter, all covered with snow, and those hungry wolves looking for you. And I don't know how Rockefeller felt in that moment, but I feel like he had been trying to outrun those wolves. And he put it in that letter. I can't guess why, but I can imagine, to ask himself, am I no longer that kid? Have I accomplished enough that I'm no longer that kid? I don't know, but on some level, it was such a powerful moment in that book. And there's so many more. I highly recommend those letters, where you're trying to feel both what he felt and what the son could be feeling reading it. And then you make it a personal experience, what it would be like to hear this. Anyways, but again, the stories can be so powerful. I want to bring up Johnny Bronfman, who wrote The Inheritance Project, Inheritance Experience. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but it was a beautiful study of people that grew up with wealth. And I think it came out a few decades ago, but it's timeless, like a lot of the things we talk about today. And one of the things I walked away with from that book was, when we grow up, wherever we grow up, we assume that everybody lives exactly the way our nearest circle lives. That's human experience. When I was growing up in Poland in the 90s, very peculiar time, but because of government policies, there were Russian cards, coupons that you had to go and collect. So even if you had money, you couldn't buy things in the store. You had to get the coupon that allowed you to buy things. And Caleb, I was convinced that all the kids in the whole world, every month, go with their grandparents to a government office to pick up those coupons to be allowed to purchase things, like everybody did in Poland. And then I realized the kids drove up to their Costco and shopped for things in bulk. So that was a shocker. But anyways, you assume that the whole world lives exactly the way you do. And then you open your eyes and realize, well, not everybody summers in Maine, and not everybody goes with their grandpa and get coupons from the government office. I think it's a very humbling experience to realize this is just my experience. I'm very curious about everybody else's experience because it will allow me to perceive the world in a more empathetic, more understanding way. And, since I'm on that topic, I'll mention one more thing. And I have a question about your personal story, your bank robbery story. I was reading a book by Lynn Twist. It's The Soul of Wealth, Soul of Money. And she tells a story how she met Mother Teresa in India. And there was a rich couple visiting with Mother Teresa, and they were not very respectful of the place. They just wanted to take a photo. And Lynn Twist told Mother Teresa, I didn't really like the way they behaved. And Mother Teresa said, you have all this compassion for the poor, and you have to have the same compassion for the rich. And I thought it's such a powerful realization, because we assume that if somebody has the means, we don't really owe them any more empathy and compassion. But we do. They're humans, and they have the shame you talk about. They have the pains. They have the worries. They're humans. The only difference is the bank account. But other than that, they wake up in the morning trying to make sure they get through the day with a smile, not with too many tears. But it just made me think, reading your materials and talking to you, how this is all a human experience. That's all. You have a very unusual story, unless you want to say something.
No, I just wanted to say there's a quote that's always stuck with me, and it was, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are.
Yes.
And that really has hit home with me. And just what you were sharing on another quote my wife and I use often is, it's hard to read the label when you're standing inside the bottle. And that's another one that's just captured that idea of we're all living a certain experience. And it's almost as if the part of the journey is moving from projecting that experience outward as if everyone's going through the same, to seeing actually that everyone is having a very different experience all around the world in different ways, and honoring and respecting and seeing people. I love that story about Mother Teresa. That's just absolutely beautiful. It reminds me of a few different stories, but I'll let us get back to our interview here.
I think the bottom line is that we need compassion for everyone.
That's right.
Let's remember that. I want to ask you about a very unusual story that I came across learning more about you. It's a Bonnie and Clyde moment in you and your wife's life. You were mistaken for bank robbers on your honeymoon. Tell me what happened and how that shaped your approach to storytelling.
Wow. So my wife and I had been married for 4 or 5 days, and we were driving, and we were actually going to see the family for the very first time. We didn't have an elaborate honeymoon. We were both modest. I was a journalist, and we're driving along, and I had just come from our bank, cashing our wedding checks of all things. And we are actually going to surprise Brittany's side of the family, because she had a lot of young siblings at the time, already missed her. Of course, she was 18 at the time. I'm 21. So we're married very young. And a police car pulls me over and starts yelling. And I'm like, this was a person from my wedding. Like his girls were our flower girls. So he must have seen our car. It says just married, on the side. It's a Mustang. It's a yellow Mustang. So it's a very flashy car. He must have seen us. And he says, put your cars on the roof. And I'm like, oh, wow, he's kind of into it. And this was rush hour traffic. And so it was surprising to me. I'm like, this seems like probably shouldn't be lawful, but hey, he's a friend. So I'm going to put the cars on my, the keys on my roof. And he has me get out of the car. And I'm like, I don't know if that sounds like his voice. And he goes, get on your knees. And I'm like, oh, so I drop on the knees, in the middle of the road. Cars are kind of now dodging around, has me get down on my face. And by the time he had come over and cuffed me and stood me up, there were 7 squad cars there. And they took me to a police car, read me my rights, put me in the back. And then I see 3 officers, 2 pistols and a shotgun, approaching my wife's side of the door. Now remember, she's 18 years old, just married me, has probably wondering who in the world have I just married. And they have her do the same thing. Thankfully, she never saw the guns. They have her get on her knees and then on her face, take her to a different car. And what we come to find out is that at the very end, they finally take me out of the car and they point me to another car. They have brought a witness. And what happened was, while I was at this bank, which my aunt was the bank manager of all things, someone was robbing it about 20 feet from me. And we both left, and we were both wearing the same jacket. And so they described the robber getting away in a yellow Mustang with "just married" written on the side. And so the officers come to us and they say, well, these things happen. Do you have any questions for us? And we said, well, we're on our honeymoon. Do you mind if we take some pictures with you? And so we took pictures with all of the officers, and we drive out to where we're going to surprise my wife's family for dinner. And guess who's there having dinner with them that evening? It was our officer friend. And so he gets on the text with all of his buddies and "you just pulled over, my buddy." And it was fascinating. We got offered counseling by the FBI after that. But really what this story taught me was that, after that happened, and this is, remind you, 5 days into marriage, I guess these things just happen. We haven't been able to top that story in now 17 years of marriage, not even close. And when I saw my family for the first time, and it was, I want to say maybe the next day, I can't remember, we were in town, so we were going to see everybody. I actually excused myself and I went downstairs and I wrote everything down. I had to capture it. It was fresh. It was alive. I was like, man, I've got to write this down. And what I learned about story is that if you don't capture it, you will lose it. If you don't put your time and energy into it, you won't get the good stuff out. It's kind of like what you put in, you get out. And one other example I'll use from my wife's side is my wife suffered some abuse as a child, and she only wrote about it years later. And it happened in one day when, for whatever reason, it was time, and she spent 10 hours that day. She was in a trance, and she wrote 10,000 words, a document, basically sharing her story. She ended up sharing that with our family, and it changed the dynamics of our family in a very beautiful way. It was the epitome of the power of story. And again, going back to what we learned from all this is, if you don't capture it, if you don't honor it and put your energy into it, then you will only get out what you put in. And what I've found is that most people put only an ounce of their energy into their story. I even heard one person recently refer to it as broccoli was like information and facts, and story was the cheese. And I heard that and I was like, oh, so you're saying that story is really just the fluff. It's the unhealthy stuff that helps the rest of life go down. I was like, no, you got that backwards. Story is the broccoli. Story is the healthy. Story carries all of the good stuff. But if we treat it like broccoli, then, all of us want to be healthy, right? So we're not going to do too much of that. And so it taught me to honor when you have felt something, like I did when we experienced that bank robbery, or when my wife felt something and felt it was time to write, capture it. Because that's when you bleed, if you will. You bleed onto the page. You capture the rawness of the story. So that's what I learned at a very early age of 21 when we were pulled over. I learned the power of, you got to capture it and you got to put in your energy into your story.
In that moment, you still remember what it felt like. And that's the juice of the story, what it really felt like, to write it down. So even if you retell the story 10, 20 years later, you can go back to that memory and feel it. You said you haven't topped that story yet. I was thinking, what would it mean to top it? And I don't want to go there. I have no idea what it would mean, but it's good it ended that way. It's nice that you run into the same people at dinner with your family. And let's leave it at that. I don't want to even imagine what it would mean to top it. So that's where my brain went for a second. But you mentioned, and you touched something, even with your wife's story, about sharing something vulnerable. And I can imagine that a lot of families or family members you work with, they're reluctant to go there. How do you go about making them comfortable to share those? Because those stories could have something really profound, powerful, that cannot be excluded.
I find that our vulnerabilities can be someone else's lifelines. So one of the things that I love to do, and really only started in the past years, I started putting on workshops. I don't like to teach, but I love to facilitate. And I started facilitating these workshops of walking people through their own personal hero's journey, truncated version, kind of what I shared earlier. And that really starts with vulnerability. And when I say our vulnerability is someone else's lifeline, is that everyone, what I found the pattern is, people are really scared to put themselves out there. I think it comes from a deep place of, will I be accepted? Will I get kicked out of my group? Will they tolerate this? All it takes is one person to start sharing, for that to unleash a tidal wave of people being able to embrace the parts of their story that they have really just locked into a closet or a basement. And one of my mentors said, like, a lot of people have locked so much in that basement. It's like toxic sludge, like rising up from the floor because it's never to be, seen or spoken of. And when I put on this workshop, and it doesn't even have to be the deepest, darkest, like my wife being abused, there can be the littlest things. I share the story of, in the community that I was raised, we were taught that emotion was wrong. I felt like I was wrong because I was an empath. I had a lot of emotion. And so for most of my life, I thought I am wrong. I shared a story about how my parents decided to homeschool me and my brothers. And I had a lot of shame around that because I would see these other kids getting on school buses and I'm thinking, am I being educated like them? I don't feel like I am. I'm dumber than they are. So I'm wrong. I'm done. And then I remember, I used to love the water slides. And I used to be the kid who would grab my parents' hand to run to the top so I could go down the slide again because he had to have a parent. And by the time I was invited later in life to a childhood birthday party, maybe we were 10 or 11, there was this popular guy. He's got abs. He's, in high school. He's so cool. And I'm just different part of the pool. And he's got all these girls around him. And he kind of just, not even meaning to, he goes, hey, don't get away from me. Go hang out with that kid or something. And I see this girl's eyes turn and she looks at me and she goes, ew. And from that point forward, I was like, oh, I'm ugly. So you have this young kid who, even though these things are not true, in my brain, I was wrong, dumb, and ugly. And I'm telling you, it took a good 20 years to disassemble those beliefs. And that's the origin of where I found them. When I can vulnerably share that and ask people what false beliefs grew in them, well, are you more likely or less likely to now introspectively look at your own life? Socrates says a life without introspection is basically not a life worth living. So I'm inviting people into that, but also show that it's not that scary. Like it's actually a freedom and a relief to look at your story with that objective lens. And so that is what I want people to, to value their story, but also to respect and honor that vulnerability, even though we are taught that you shouldn't be vulnerable. You got to have your guard up. You got to protect, right? That's instinctual for us, but there are times when it is very healing, and what's standing in between you and your own growth and someone else's lifeline is for you to be vulnerable. And it's a gift to the world when you can do that in a healthy way.
I love that line, and I was writing it down. One person's vulnerability is another person's lifeline. Just letting them know what you went through. The same idea we talked about earlier, how we assume everybody's living our experience. Sometimes we assume that nobody has ever gone through what we're going through, right? And then you realize, no, there are other people going through something similar. Maybe what you just shared could help somebody else see their situation from a different perspective and maybe cut themselves a little bit more slack and go easier on themselves, as we sometimes do the opposite. I'm very curious about this changing world that we have. With the digital age, we're taking so many pictures and it feels like you can record more things. How does that change your work, from the analog to digital, and how does that affect the way we can preserve legacy the way you do?
Yeah, technology is a beautiful thing that opens up a lot of doors. My wife and I, when I got out of journalism and we went the traditional route, finding an agent, literary agent, took 7 years to publish traditionally. And then I remember when the ebook came out and the entire industry was scared to death. Like, what does this mean for books and so forth? And the digital age, one of the best ways I can look at it is like this. It's like the more accessible something is, the less we can value it. And it's kind of like, I remember going over to my grandma and grandpa's and they would have those family yearbooks, right? It's like 1996, 1997, and they would curate a life and really spend a lot of time on it. And I think that is what the digital age has kind of brought. It's that we no longer value certain photos because we have so many photos. And so the work that I do now, I've always, Myers-Briggs, I'm an INFJ. I want to fill a gap in the world. I care about making meaning. And so one of the ways that we use kind of or view storytelling and why we even do books and even beyond that, we create legacy boxes is what we're trying to do is capture what you put in, you get out. How can you make this special? How can you make one thing incredibly beautiful? Make one copy of it for one child and then one child. And even, I'm not sure if we're on video or not, but to put something like this in someone's keepsake box. And even though we have digitals for backups, we're delivering something.
Can you say what it is for those that are only listening?
Oh, yes. For those who are only listening, we have these legacy boxes, and they're a beautiful handcrafted wood with, the family's name and our legacy box. And in it is a copy of their story, a beautiful, leather-bound book or however we co-created it together. And then a letter individually for each child covering those 4 things I mentioned. I love you. I'm proud of you. Here's how I've messed up. Here's what I hope for your future. And then the family story, which really is the family's values played out through story. It's a show, don't tell. And so that's a maybe a bit of a tangent. I'm coming across from the digital age, but what we're trying to bring back is this is your lived inheritance, your inheritance of experiences. Because I heard it best said, I can't remember who said it. I wish I could give them credit, but it was that idea of if you could choose wealth, wisdom, or values to pass on to the next generation, I don't know one person who's going to put wealth at the top. They're going to start with the wisdom. They're going to start with the values, and those are only passed through experiences. Story is how we capture and codify the experiences. It's the most important of the 3, but the wealth is the easiest because it's there's nothing easy about it, as you know. There's estate planning, there's complex documents, but it is something much more tangible. But like you said, without the wisdom and the values, it is shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. So going back to the digital age, why we create legacy boxes, why we create prints, beautiful prints of the stories, is we're putting so much into this because it's that important. And there's only one copy for you because it's that important. Cherish it. Cherishes it. This is that one thing you'll grab if your house is on fire, and it's what you're taking with you.
I love that it's tangible in the world where so few things are tangible. It's something you can actually hold and give to somebody. I tell my clients that we are here to give money meaning. This money exists in a context, and the stories you share and the wisdom and the values we talked about gives it some context. Why are we even doing it? I want to ask you about some unexpected outcomes. You talk about the box. You're opening a box here. You're looking around. You're looking in places and spaces that haven't been explored in a while. And some of those stories, maybe 1 or 2 family members know. Now all of them will know. I mean, there's so many layers and so many dynamics that you're touching and maybe disrupting a little bit too. I'm very curious what you can share about some unexpected outcomes of this process.
My favorite unexpected outcome is the basic need to be seen and heard and understood. It is a interesting contrast when you are working with highly successful, have experienced so much in life, have a great degree of intelligence, capability, capacity, and all of a sudden spend quite a bit of time on themselves with a team that is so curious and wants to know and to understand them at a deep level. It surprises people going through our process, which is usually a 16 to 18 month process. And front loaded on that, we're spending about an hour a week together. It is a very fascinating process when you start to dive into your own story. And a lot happens and a lot comes up. And usually by the time we're at the end of the process, a client will say some version of, this has been more for me, even more so than the product, than the tool of our family legacy captured in stories, than I set out to achieve. That is really exciting because it created an experience that money cannot buy. Because in a way, it was a side door, a project, a service working with, something like Renown where we're capturing story. But it was a side door into something that they never really gave themselves permission to, of how can I be better known? How can I be better understood? Well, it's through the story. It's through talking it out. And there's such a power in our words. That's something that I didn't hit on, but that's the unexpected. There is power in our words. I don't know how personal storytelling works, but tying into that vulnerability, the truth of what happened, all those things. Story is like, it's like a pipe that comes all down our esophagus, deep into the deepest parts of us. And when we share our story, when we start to become understood and we hear it coming out of our own mouth, any negative things attached to it lose their power. And I saw this, just seeing patterns, when I read a book called Never Split the Difference. Chris Voss, I believe. And he was an FBI negotiator, and he shared this story about how, when they're trying to communicate with someone who's got hostages on the other side of the door, they'll pound on the door and they'll say, hey, we know you're probably scared that we're going to come in guns a-blazing, you're probably going to lose your life, you may not live to see tomorrow. And they're speaking all these words, and even someone on the other side hearing words spoken that he's feeling inside actually releases something. And all of a sudden he's like, you know what? I actually think I want to live through this night, and I'm going to release these hostages. And so that can happen just by sharing your story, and by having a team like ours come in and ask those questions and yearn for that understanding of what their life has meant and what they've gone through. And it's a beautiful thing to see.
Words have power. Words your truths. Describing even the stories we talked about, I can only imagine how you can tell the same thing with different words and reach an audience in a different way. Caleb, I have one big question. I'm very curious about your personal definition of success. How do you think about it?
I love this because it's one of my favorite definitions I've seen just recently. And it was that the old wealth narrative is I will make a lot of money and then I'll be wealthy. And the new wealth narrative was I will be wealthy when I have an abundance of what I value. And I have no problem saying that I am one of the wealthiest men to walk this earth, men or women. And what do I value? I value peace. I love contributing to this world in a way that feels like I was born for it. I'm giving my gift to others. What's that quote about kind of the purpose of life is to find your meaning or what have you, and then the next step is to give it away. I value that. I value autonomy and freedom. That's come to me by having my own company. I value deep friendships with a good drink and nothing to do other than talk and to dive deep with each other. I recently heard a study about how couples live longer when they kiss for 6 seconds. So I love kissing my wife for 6 seconds. I value that. There's a closeness and a beauty that comes with that. I love slower mornings. I love weekends that aren't crazy. I love my health and providing time for that. I love a life that aligns with my soul. One of the greatest things I did for myself over the past year was join a group that essentially for an entire year walked through vision, mission, values. And the hardest trek of that was separating what was aspirational and what was true, what was really like radiated from you. And that was a beautiful thing because I got to essentially see myself experienced not aspirationally. And I really got to see like what my vision was for my life. I got to see what my mission was, what I do every day, if you will. And I got to really hone in on my values, which came down to craftsmanship. I'm a craftsman at heart. I love the written word. Trust. I love showing up authentically and casting zero judgment, allowing others to show up authentically. And then love. For someone like me, I get overwhelmed by the hurt in this world, all the hard things that are going on. So for me, love is to love people in your proximity. If I'm on a Zoom call, that's someone's in my proximity. If I'm on a podcast, if someone comes to my door, like just be love where you're at. And so that's wealth to me. Wealth is having an abundance of what I value. And those are the things I value. And what I love about it is that unlike wealth, those things really can't be taken away from me. Yes, health deteriorates. Yes, friendships come and go, but there's such a peace and harmony and alignment of living for things that I value. That means something. That's my definition of success.
I love everything I'm hearing, and I really like your definition of wealth. And you brought up this idea that you were born to do this. And I can say that I feel that I was born to do what I do, help families in the way that I do. And it's such a wonderful thing to be able to discover what it is and to be actually able to do that in this lifetime. And everything else that you said, I really appreciate. I really enjoyed this conversation. You got me really thinking about so many topics, and I feel like I asked you so many questions and I have so many more, but I really appreciate this hour that you shared with me, and think of all the homes that this conversation will be listened to, and they'll bring it up during their dinner conversation, and who knows, some different stories will be triggered or introduced to family members that have never heard of those stories. So I'm very excited about the impact and the effect that this conversation can have on the people listening. So I appreciate it so much, Caleb. Thank you so much for today.
This has been a wonderful honor. And just as I tell anyone that we're connecting with, I say, like, this is a sacred thing. Your story is sacred. And I feel like you treated this conversation as sacred, and I so appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to share a bit of my story and my life purpose. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caleb. You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski.